Hello, I'm Daniela. I recently published a video where I demonstrated how you could use crayon on fabric to getting really wonderful results. Well, the response was overwhelming. It was very positive and there were a lot of very considerate comments, which I really appreciate. But there were so many questions, so I wanted to do a follow-up video answering some of those questions. The first question that I got that was the most popular question was, after you create your image on fabric using crayon, is it washable? Well, the answer is yes, but there are caveats. So in the process that I showed, you created the image on fabric. Now, I drew directly on fabric. There are other methods, and I'll go into that in this video because that's another question. But you create your image. You get your crayons onto your fabric, and then you have to heat set it. And the reason you heat set it is, number one, to remove the wax from the crayon. So I use a paper towel on top of my image and then the iron on top of that paper towel. And I'll do this a few times. I press that iron onto that paper towel at the heat of the fabric. Now, the fabric has to be a natural fabric, like cotton or linen, possibly silk, although I don't have any experience using silk, so I hope somebody else can comment on that as well. When you press your hot iron onto your paper towel on top of your crayon image, the wax in the crayons melt and you're left with just the dye. And that sits in the fabric. It's actually absorbed into the fabric. Now, the heat from the iron not only removes the wax, melts the wax, and then the paper towel absorbs it, but it sets the image, it sets the colors into the fabric. And so with a few times of the heat setting process with that paper towel, you really set that image thoroughly into your fabrics. It can be laundered. Eventually, over time, many people comment that they've done this technique, but through time, the image might fade and need to be refreshed. So you'll just go through that same process again, adding more color with your crayons, pressing it with a paper towel and a hot iron, and then heat setting it again, and your image will be refreshed and new. Now, your results will vary based on the fabric you use and the colors you use and the brands of crayons. Now, I use Crayola crayons and I got great results. Now, I can't speak to other brands. I really stick with Crayola frequently. I'm not sponsored by them. I just really like Crayola products. I always have. I think they're really good quality. The next question was, have you used fabric crayons, and is there a difference between using the fabric crayons and the Crayola crayons? Well, I tried this out. I had not previously used fabric crayons. So I purchased a set of Pentel fabric dye sticks and I used them. I colored them on my image and I got a really nice result. The Pentel dye sticks are a little different in feel than the Crayola crayons. They're not very expensive, but they do cost more than the Crayola crayons. The color supply is limited and they feel more like an oil pastel. They're very sticky. It's fun to work with. It's a different technique. It's slightly a different feel. And if you prefer that feel, that tackiness of the dye sticks sticking to your fabric, you like that tactile sensation, I'd say go ahead and use them. But other than that, after heat setting them and following the directions for the Pentel crayons versus the directions that I showed you using the Crayola crayons, well, I didn't really get much of a difference in the result. And in going forward in the future, I would just stick personally to the Crayola crayons. But if you have experience with the Pentel dye sticks and you'd like to tell me more about that, I'd love to learn more in the comments, so please comment below. Another group of people said that they used to use beeswax crayons. They were made by Prang. I guess most of the Prang crayons were made by beeswax before they changed the formula, and they're now soy wax. Well, I found a set of Prang beeswax crayons, and I use those as well. They were very fun to use. They were geared towards little kids, so they were a little bigger than Crayola crayons, a little more expensive. They were fun to use. I really didn't notice much difference. So I'm going to stick with my Crayola crayons. For me, that really worked. I did a swatch of fabric where I had the Crayola crayons, the Pentel dye sticks, and the beeswax crayons as well. I colored different colors because I know the colors act differently. I heat set them all according to the directions that I follow, and then I wash them. And you can see with the results, there was a slight bit of fading, which is to be expected, but overall, I'm sticking with the Crayola crayons, and you can see the difference for yourself. It really comes down to what you feel most comfortable using. and what you prefer to use for your crayons onto fabric. Another question had to do with the process of drawing directly on the fabric. In the video, I showed where I drew directly onto the fabric with crayons, freehand, without a template. Some people asked if you're not comfortable drawing directly on the fabric, if you're either not confident in your drawing skills or you're not really sure what to do, what are some other methods? And they alluded to a few in particular. Some people had said that instead of using the freezer paper on the back of the fabric to stabilize it, they actually colored onto the freezer paper, then flipped the freezer paper over and ironed it, and they transferred their image. So I decided to try that. I colored some images onto freezer paper. Now, freezer paper is paper that in the United States you find at the grocery store, in the section where they sell plastic wrap and aluminum foil. And you purchase it, and it's one side of paper and one side plastic. And so when we color on the plastic, the crayon sits on top of that plastic, and when you flip it over, you're putting your crayon directly onto your fabric. I used a process where I took that freezer paper and I ironed that plastic onto the back side of my fabric, and that gave me a little bit of a stabilizer so that when I did color on the fabric moved less. Didn't stop it from moving, it just made it a little more secure. I also showed a method where I put a piece of sandpaper underneath my work to hold the fabric in place. You don't even need either one of those. You could tape your fabric down to your surface, or you can just wing it and go with it. The fabric does tend to move, and so that's why I showed that method. Now, some people had said that they colored onto the freezer paper, flipped it over, heat set it, and it melted onto their fabric. Well, I didn't get great results with that. I did get some transfer, not a fantastic image, not a standalone image. I did, however, get an image that is great for using as a guide. So from there, I would continue coloring onto the fabric. I had my guide, my first image that I transferred, and now I just do another layer or two to get the exact colors and the image that I want. In fact, I was really curious, if I took this freezer paper where I've already transferred the image once, what kind of transfer would I get the second time? So I ironed it onto my fabric, let it cool, and then when I removed it, well, I was disappointed. There was nothing there. So you get a one-time use from coloring on that freezer paper and then transferring it. I found that if I took that freezer paper, the shiny side, the plastic side, and I drew my image, just the silhouette of my image, kind of a line art drawing, and then I ironed it to the wrong side of my muslin, I could see through it, and then I kind of had a guide, and it was like tracing onto the paper. When I removed that freezer paper, there was nothing left there. There was no image. There might be some remnants of a transfer on the back of your fabric. So keep that in mind if you don't want any image on the back of your fabric. If it's something that's not going to show and you don't mind, then it'll be fine. Another method of transfer that people asked about was coloring directly on the sandpaper, flipping that over so that the crayon was touching the fabric and ironing that. And I got very interesting results with that. I drew a cupcake onto sandpaper. Now, when you draw with crayon on sandpaper, it actually wears down the crayon a lot. So you get a great amount of crayon on your sandpaper, a really good result. So there's a lot of wax and a lot of pigment. And when I flipped it over and ironed it, the results were unexpected. They were beautiful, but they were very different. It wasn't a pristine image. The image was pixelated almost looking. It had little dots from where the raised sand on the sandpaper was. I loved the results. It was completely unexpected, but it can be used just like it is, or once again, I can use that as the basis of my drawing and color over that image. So there's lots of variations you can get by using crayons and sandpaper, either to hold your fabric down or to color directly on the sandpaper and then flip it over and heat set it onto your fabric. Now, after I ironed it onto my fabric and melted that crayon, transferred that image, I did take a paper towel and melt some of the wax off onto the paper towel. I had to do that a few times because if you remember me telling you, you get a lot of crayon onto that sandpaper. So therefore you get a lot of crayon onto your fabric. So you'll have to iron with your paper towel a number of times. and then heat set it just to make sure you get a really nice result. Out of curiosity, I ironed over that sandpaper again after I had already transferred it once. I was curious to see if there would be more residue, more crayon left on the sandpaper that would transfer onto the fabric, and maybe I'd get a second print. Well, that was not the case. There was nothing left on the sandpaper after the first transfer. So that was a little bit disappointing, but very helpful. Another question was, can I color directly on paper, flip that paper over, iron it on my fabric, and get a transfer that way? Well, you might. I did not get a good result. I had a coloring book that I used crayons on, and then I flipped that coloring book over and ironed it onto the fabric. And because the wax came through the paper, the back of the paper that I was ironing on, I thought I might get some kind of transfer. But when I removed the paper, I didn't get much transfer at all. So that tells me that you need some type of material, like the plastic on the freezer paper, or the sand on the sandpaper, that will hold that crayon and not absorb it into the paper itself. If you have more experience with that, or maybe I just didn't use enough crayon, please comment and let me know as well. Now there are a couple of other methods if you want to add an image to your fabric without drawing directly without a guide. Now you can use a light pad. Just put your drawing that you want to trace onto the light pad itself and then cover it with your fabric. Now here I have the freezer paper on the fabric, which made it very hard to see. So I removed the freezer paper and put it right on top of my drawing. You can see it much better here. To hold it in place, I just used some painter's tape and I taped it directly to the light pad. And from there I could just trace over the image that I wanted to capture onto my fabric. I made the silhouette. I could remove it from the light pad and color it in. I used a blend of colors from white to light pink to dark red. And from there I heat set it using that paper towel and my iron. And the paper towel absorbed quite a bit of the wax. Another option is to use stencils. Just place your stencil on top of your paper, and here I put freezer paper underneath my paper to stabilize it. It's an optional step. And then I color inside the stencil using some colors. I'm not worried about making it perfect. I'm just trying to sketch out the shape here. I'll choose an assortment of colors and just start to fill in the stencil. You can choose just to outline it to use it as your sketch. After the image is filled in nicely, I'll remove the stencil and start to fill in and add a little more to the image using crayon. I'll fill in any gaps, add any details, and then I have a nice image from a stencil. You'll want to continue to heat set this and use your paper towel to absorb the wax, and you'll have a great image that you can use from a stencil. Another method that you can use to transfer your image to your fabric is to use rubber stamps and fabric ink. Now I bought specific fabric ink that's designed for fabric and wood and some other things, and I'll include the link below. I just applied the ink to a rubber stamp, and then I stamped it onto some fabric that I had already lined with freezer paper. From there I got a beautiful image. Now I didn't see directions on the ink pad whether I should heat set it then or wait until after I applied the crayon. So I made a judgment call and I heat set it then. Once the ink was dry on the fabric, I took my hot iron over it and just held it there for about 5 to 10 seconds. And that secured that ink to the fabric. And then from there, I colored in that image. In my case, I used a rose stamp. And so I just colored in with a few colors of pink and a few reds. I got a beautiful result. So using rubber stamps onto fabric is a great idea. Thank you. I also received a question on whether you could use Aida cloth with this technique involving using the crayons. Aida cloth is very textured and it's beautiful for cross stitch and some embroidery. I colored onto the canvas and it took a lot of crayon, but the results were wonderful, especially when I heat set it. I couldn't believe how beautiful it looked. It's a great way to make your own image if you want to create your own pattern for cross stitch. Another question that I was asked was, what do I mean by slow stitching? I said that after you have your image transferred onto your fabric that you've colored in and heat set and it's ready to go, I like to slow stitch with it.
Slow stitching is about hand sewing in a very simple way, just in a way that you enjoy. It can be anything from knitting to crocheting. I like to use embroidery stitches, and nothing in particular, nothing set or traditional necessarily. So here are two images, the image from the stencil and the image from the light pad, and I added a few additional stitches to them. This is just a patch that I'll use in future work. To give you an idea of what a completed slow stitching project looks like for me, I had this page from a fabric book that I made. I created the drawing of the owl here, the barn owl, shaded it with some of the crayons, and then I added additional stitches to embellish it. I added trim, additional stitches, and it's part of a fabric book. The crayon image is just the basis. The stitching is something I do to enhance it. And I'll show you more of that in the video, where I take you from drawing an image to using your patch in your slow stitching work.
So I have a different video coming out that shows that entire process from start to finish, but I want to show you some examples of slow stitching or embroidery onto fabric. Now the beauty of using crayons on fabric is that you can stitch through them. It's not like a thick plasticky paint, which acrylic paint is lovely and it does very well on fabric, but it's really hard to get a needle through. There are other different types of paints and dyes that you can use, but I found that crayon works beautifully. And this could help me guarantee a custom image, either an image that I draw or now an image that I can use rubber stamps with. Anything along those lines. And so there are different ways to embellish it with thread and beads and buttons. And I have lots of slow stitching projects, and so using the crayon to create images really opens up a whole new world. The last question that I received an abundance of was, what iron am I using? I use a little steam fast travel iron. The reason I use it is because it's small, lightweight, and it heats up very quickly. It's also a great size for filming, because a large iron will take up the entire screen. But this little iron is really cute. When I'm creating my slow stitching videos, a lot of time I just want to press something down or iron out some wrinkles on a smaller scale. I'm not ironing bed sheets or large shirts, just small little items that I like to hand stitch. So those are the most popular questions that I received for my video on creating fabric images with crayons. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you have additional questions, please post them below. I want to thank you for joining me today. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. And please consider becoming a paid member of my channel, where I give bonus content, additional techniques, and a little glimpse into my personal life. Thanks for joining me today.